In the heart of Russia, where winter's icy grip tightened its hold, a chill wind began to stir, carrying with it whispers of a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of the empire. For in this time of political turmoil, the year was 1849, and the city was St. Petersburg. A shadow had fallen over the city, a shadow cast by the specter of change. The air crackled with the electricity of dissent, and the people, long accustomed to the heavy hand of authority, began to murmur about reforms and revolution. Fyodor Dostoevsky, a young man wrestling with his place in this maelstrom of change, found solace in the company of like-minded intellectuals. Among them was the esteemed historian whose insights into literature and society had already begun to carve his name in the annals of Russian thought. Belinsky was not merely a historian. He was a visionary who saw in the past a reflection of the present and a guide for the future. His writings were a clarion call for a new Russia, one that was not shackled by the chains of tradition but was marching towards the light of progress. Another prominent member of the circle was the philosopher Nikolai Stankovich, whose thoughts delved into the labyrinth of the human mind, seeking to unravel the complexities of existence and purpose. Stankovich's ideas were like stars scattered across the night sky, offering guidance and enlightenment to those who looked up to him. And then there was the enigmatic Mikhail Petrushevsky, the host of the gatherings, a man whose name would become synonymous with this clandestine group that dared to challenge the status quo. Petrushevsky was a beacon of liberal thought, his house a sanctuary where ideas flowed like wine, and the future of Russia was debated with fervor and passion. Into this crucible of intellect and dissent, Dostoevsky stepped, a young writer grappling with his craft and his conscience. The discussions that took place in Petrushevsky's home were not mere academic exercises. They were acts of courage in a society where dissent was often met with reprisal. Here, under the cloak of secrecy, the brightest minds of Russia dared to dream of a better future. They spoke of individual rights, of social reforms, and of a Russia that was not just great, but was a beacon of liberty and equality. Dostoevsky, initially hesitant, found his voice among these men. He listened intently, absorbing their ideas, letting their words ferment in his mind, preparing him for the literary revolution that was about to unfold. Among the books that circulated in the group was the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, a text that would send shockwaves across Europe and challenge the very fabric of society. Dostoevsky, ever the seeker of truth, grappled with the ideas presented in the manifesto, trying to reconcile them with his own beliefs and experiences. And then there was the utopian novel Looking Backwards by Charles Fourier, a work that painted a picture of a society organized around the principles of equality, cooperation, and peace. Dostoevsky, always fascinated by the human condition, pondered the possibility of such a society, wondering if it was just a pipe dream or a blueprint for the future. These discussions and the ideas that dominated them were not merely intellectual exercises. They were acts of defiance in a society that stifled creativity and dissent. They were the sparks that ignited Dostoevsky's literary genius, shaping him into the profound thinker we know today. Yet as the weeks turned into months, a cloud of suspicion began to gather over the group. The watchful eyes of the secret police, ever vigilant for signs of disloyalty or sedition, were now focused on Petrushevsky's house. The group's heretical discussions had not gone unnoticed, and the walls of Petrushevsky's house were about to come crashing down. In the dead of night, the tranquility of the group's gatherings was shattered. The knock on the door was not from an admirer or a fellow seeker of knowledge. It was the unwelcome intrusion of authority. The members of the Petrushevsky circle, engaged in their fervent discussions, were ensnared by the long arm of the law. In that moment of betrayal, Dostoevsky's life took a sharp turn. The comfortable world he had known was about to be replaced by the stark realities of imprisonment and exile. As he stood before the judge, the weight of the charges against him pressed down like a physical burden. The accusation of subversive activity, of engaging in activities that threatened the stability and authority of the state, seemed like a travesty of justice to him. He had merely sought the company of kindred spirits, engaging in discussions that enriched his mind and soul. How could this be construed as a crime? Yet the verdict was inevitable in a society where dissent was synonymous with sedition. He was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in a Siberian prison, a fate worse than death for a man who valued his freedom and his intellectual pursuits above all else. But amidst the despair, a flicker of hope emerged. His sentence was commuted to exile in the remote town of Am, where he was to spend 4 years under close surveillance, forbidden from engaging in any form of intellectual discourse or writing. This was not the end. It was a new beginning, a descent into the abyss from which few had emerged unscathed. As he embarked on his journey to Omsky, Dostoevsky carried with him not just his personal baggage, but the hopes and dreams of a generation of Russian intellectuals. His exile was seen as a symbol of the regime's intolerance, a warning to those who dared to question the status quo. In the desolate expanse of Siberia, Dostoevsky found himself stripped of the privileges that had once defined his life. No longer the celebrated author or the respected intellectual, he was just another nameless face in a crowd of exiles. The biting cold of the Siberian winter seeped into his bones, a physical manifestation of the emotional chill that had descended upon him. He was surrounded by fellow exiles, each with their own tales of woe and disillusionment. Together, they formed a community of shared suffering, bound together by the invisible threads of their experiences. It was during this period of profound isolation and introspection that Dostoevsky's true literary genius began to emerge. The vast emptiness of the Siberian landscape mirrored the hollowness he felt within, a void that needed to be filled with the richness of human emotion and experience. His time in Siberia was not just a punishment. It was a crucible that refined his writing, turning it into a powerful exploration of the human psyche. He began to delve deep into the minds of his characters, exploring their motivations, their fears, and their dreams with a depth and realism that had never been seen before in Russian literature. Upon his return from Siberia, Dostoevsky found himself forever changed. The abyss he had stared into had brought him face to face with his own mortality. With the fragility of the human spirit and with the indomitable strength of the human soul, he emerged from the shadows of his past, not as a defeated man, but as a literary giant ready to share his hard-earned wisdom with the world. With a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of humanity, Dostoevsky began to write with a fervor that shocked the literary world. His novels became instant classics, resonating with readers not just in Russia, but across the globe. He explored themes of suffering, redemption, and the search for meaning in a world that often seemed devoid of both. His characters, complex and flawed, became timeless representations of the human struggle for morality and enlightenment in a society teetering on the edge of chaos and renewal. And so it was that from the ashes of persecution rose one of the greatest literary figures of all time, Fyodor Dostoevsky, the man who had dared to dream of a better Russia, a man who had stared into the abyss of suffering and emerged with a profound understanding of the human condition, continued to write until his death. His legacy lives on, not just in his powerful novels, but in the ideas and emotions he brought to life. For in the end, it was not the darkness of his imprisonment that defined him, but the brilliance of his literary genius that shone brightly for all to see. The persecution of Fyodor Dostoevsky by the Russian authorities was a tragic chapter in the story of one of the greatest writers in history, but it was also a testament to the power of ideas and the resilience of the human spirit. Dostoevsky's journey from a young writer with dreams of making a difference to a man wrestling with his conscience and finally emerging as a literary titan serves as a reminder that the darkest moments can often lead to the brightest triumphs. His life was a reflection of the Russian soul, a blend of passion, suffering, and the eternal search for meaning. And it is this authenticity, this unflinching portrayal of the human condition that continues to resonate with readers even today. In the grand tapestry of world literature, Dostoevsky's name shines as a beacon, guiding us through the labyrinth of human emotions and experiences. His was a life marked by both extraordinary highs and devastating lows, mirroring the complexity of the human condition itself. From the heights of literary acclaim to the depths of prison despair, and from the bleak landscapes of Siberia to the bustling streets of St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky's journey was a microcosm of the Russian experience in the 19th century. His life story is a powerful reminder that it is often in the darkest moments of our lives that the seeds of our greatest triumphs are sown. Through his personal struggles, Dostoevsky gained a profound understanding of the human condition, allowing him to create characters and narratives that continue to captivate and challenge readers even today. His literary legacy serves as a testament to the power of the human spirit to endure, adapt, and ultimately triumph in the face of adversity. And so, as we reflect on the extraordinary life of Fyodor Dostoevsky, let us remember that it is in the depths of our despair that we often find the strength and inspiration to reach new heights in our endeavors. His life was a journey into the heart of darkness, from which he emerged as a shining example of resilience, creativity, and the unyielding power of the human spirit. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel so that you never miss out on any of my videos. Thanks for watching. From near death to spiritual awakening in Siberian prison in September 80, Dostoevsky, along with his fellow prisoners, was marched to Semyonovsky Square in St. Petersburg, where their fate would be sealed. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as the condemned men stood before the firing squad. For Dostoevsky, the moment was one of complete surrender. As the death sentence was read aloud, he believed his life was coming to an abrupt and terrifying end. His heart raced, his breath shallow, and he turned to one of his fellow prisoners, sharing a moment of finality, whispering, "We shall be with Christ." The atheist beside him, however, only smiled and pointed to the ground, a handful of dust. This chilling moment of imminent death became a profound turning point in Dostoevsky's spiritual and intellectual life, something he later described as mystic terror. In his final moments, he could not help but divide his remaining time into stages, as if to wrest some meaning from the cruel inevitability. 2 minutes to bid farewell to the world, 2 minutes for introspection, and the last few moments to take in one final view of life as he knew it. Facing death at 27, full of health and promise, he found himself reflecting on everything he had left behind the future. The unfinished work, the dreams unrealized. But then, an unexpected twist. A card appeared, carrying a letter from the Tsar, commuting their death sentences to a 4-year term of hard labor in Siberia. The men who had moments earlier expected their final breath were now condemned to a new life, though far from free. The shock was almost as great as the relief. Dostoevsky, whose life had been hanging by a thread just moments before, was now facing the next chapter of his existence in a far more insidious form. As Dostoevsky returned to his cell in the Peter and Paul fortress to await his transfer, he was struck by a strange sense of both relief and despair. While he had been spared from immediate death, the realization dawned on him that his life had been wasted in many ways. In his prison letter to his brother, Dostoevsky admitted that he had squandered countless opportunities, spending much of his earlier years in self-doubt, failure, and frivolous pursuits. The reality of his mortality and the near miss with execution forced him to confront how little he had appreciated the gift of life. In the darkest moments of his imprisonment, Dostoevsky felt a renewed sense of purpose, vowing to live more fully, with a deeper commitment to his art, his fellow man, and his own soul. The journey to Siberia was brutal. The prison camp itself was a nightmare, cold, filthy, and filled with disease. Dostoevsky found himself in the company of some of the most depraved individuals in Russia, thieves and criminals of all kinds. The harsh physical conditions, combined with the unrelenting cold, created a suffocating environment where life seemed to have little value. Yet, it was within this hellish landscape that Dostoevsky's soul was both tested and forged anew. The suffering he endured would have crushed a lesser man. But for Dostoevsky, it became the crucible of spiritual and intellectual awakening. The days in the Siberian prison camp were long and grueling, marked by unceasing labor and extreme isolation. Although he was surrounded by hundreds of prisoners, Dostoevsky often felt more alone than ever. The constant surveillance, the inability to escape from the harsh glare of the authorities, and the oppressive atmosphere of the camp weighed heavily on his spirit. But it was in this isolation that Dostoevsky began to grapple with the most profound questions about human existence, spirituality, and the nature of suffering. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to distract him, no distractions from his thoughts, no books to read, no audience to impress. He was left alone with his mind. This forced solitude became a catalyst for Dostoevsky's profound self. In the absence of the material comforts and distractions of the outside world, he began to explore his inner life with an intensity he had never known before. The physical hardships he endured mirrored the emotional and psychological turmoil he had long been carrying within himself. He began to understand how his early life had been shaped by fear, shame, and insecurity. He came to realize that, in many ways, he had been living a life driven by these fears. The prison became a space for him to confront these weaknesses head-on, and it was here that Dostoevsky's philosophy began to take shape. Dostoevsky's time in Siberia also illuminated for him the nature of power and human cruelty. The prison guards, once ordinary men, had been transformed by the power they held over the prisoners. Many of them were initially decent and humble, but as they gained authority, they became tyrannical, cruel, and dehuman. Dostoevsky observed this transformation closely, and it left a deep impact on his understanding of the relationship between power and evil. In his later works, particularly in the Brothers Karamazov and Notes from the House of the Dead, Dostoevsky would explore how the experience of power could strip people of their humanity, turning them into monsters. Yet amidst the darkness of the prison camp, Dostoevsky also encountered moments of moral clarity that would deeply shape his worldview. He saw that even among the most hardened criminals, there were instances of profound kindness, self-sacrifice, and moral reflection. These prisoners, despite their crimes, found ways to hold on to their dignity and, in some cases, even demonstrated compassion toward their fellow men. These moments of unexpected wisdom, selflessness, and introspection struck Dostoevsky deeply, and he began to realize that the human soul could not be easily categorized into good and evil. Rather, every person contained the potential for both. This insight would become one of the central themes of Dostoevsky's later works. He came to believe that true understanding of the human soul could only be achieved through a deep examination of its contradictions. The struggle between good and evil was not an external battle, but a war waged within the individual. It was this understanding of the human soul's complexity that would shape Dostoevsky's writing, particularly in works such as Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov, where characters wrestle with the darkness within themselves and the possibility of redemption. One of the greatest revelations Dostoevsky had in prison was the importance of meaning and purpose in human life. Throughout his time in Siberia, he observed that the prisoners who had some form of meaning, whether through religion, work, or relationships, were able to endure the hardship of prison life. Those without meaning, on the other hand, often succumbed to despair. Dostoevsky came to understand that human beings could survive almost anything as long as they had something to strive for. This realization would become one of the central tenets of his later philosophy, short expansion. As Dostoevsky's time in Siberia drew to a close, he began to recognize the profound impact that his experiences had on his creative mind. The harsh reality of the prison camp had stripped him of his previous naivety and had revealed the complexities of human existence in its most raw and brutal form. The suffering, the deprivation, and the constant tension between life and death had forced him to confront the deepest aspects of his own soul. Despite the grimness of his physical circumstances, Dostoevsky came to understand that suffering could be both transformative and redemptive. It was in this intense struggle with life and death that he began to see human potential in its most fragile and pure form. His ability to observe the human soul's capacity for both light and darkness, to wrestle with its contradictions, and to explore the tension between sin and redemption, all stemmed from these harrowing years. The hardships he endured would, ironically, become the key to unlocking the deepest corners of human nature in his future novels. Upon his release, Dostoevsky was no longer the same man. The transformation he had undergone was not only intellectual or spiritual, but profoundly personal. The writer who emerged from the Siberian prison camp was a man who had witnessed both the depths of human depravity and the potential for salvation. His later works would reflect this newfound understanding of the human condition, driven by the belief that no one, regardless of their flaws, was beyond the possibility of redemption. By the time Dostoevsky was released from the Siberian prison camp in 1854, he had undergone a profound transformation. The man who had entered prison disillusioned, fearful, and lost had been replaced by a man of deep spiritual insight and philosophical clarity. The suffering he had endured had become the foundation of his greatest literary achievements. Through his time in prison, Dostoevsky learned that the path to greatness often runs through the darkest of valleys. From exile to mastery, Dostoevsky's release from the Siberian prison camp in 1880, he returned to a Russia that had changed in both subtle and dramatic ways. The man who had once been a promising literary talent, then a disillusioned prisoner, now emerged with a new, almost mystical understanding of human nature. His experiences had honed his ability to observe the inner workings of the human soul, and he had developed a deep empathy for those who wrestled with the complexities of morality, redemption, and suffering. The journey that took Dostoevsky from a prisoner to one of the greatest writers of the 19th century was not an easy one. Though freed from the physical confines of the Siberian camp, Dostoevsky found himself trapped in the complex webs of his own thoughts and fears. His health continued to deteriorate, and he remained financially unstable, unable to pay his debts. His psychological struggles, exacerbated by his intense epileptic seizures and the toll that imprisonment had taken on his mind, continued to affect his life. Yet, it was during this time of hardship that Dostoevsky's true genius began to emerge. His understanding of the human condition had deepened profoundly, and he began to channel this insight into his writing. His earlier works had been marked by a certain naive idealism, but the man who returned from Siberia had a much darker, more complex view of life. He had learned that true human strength was not found in the ease of comfort, but in the ability to endure suffering, to confront one's deepest fears, and to overcome inner darkness. Dostoevsky's return to writing was not an immediate success. His early post-prison works, including The Village of Stepanchikovo and Humiliated and Insulted, failed to capture the public's attention. These novels, while containing early echoes of the philosophical depth Dostoevsky would later become famous for, were largely overshadowed by the dominance of other literary figures in Russia at the time. Critics were quick to dismiss Dostoevsky as a writer who had lost his touch, but Dostoevsky was undeterred. He knew that the insights gained during his time in Siberia, the profound revelations about suffering, evil, and human nature had prepared him for the next stage of his artistic journey. He set to work on a new novel, Crime and Punishment, which would solidify his place as one of the greatest literary minds of his time. This novel would mark the beginning of his most productive and influential period as a writer, during which he would produce some of his most well-known works, including The Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot and Demons. Crime and Punishment was a masterful exploration of the psychology of guilt, redemption, and the moral struggles of the human soul. The novel's protagonist, Raskolnikov, is a young, intelligent student who believes that certain extraordinary individuals are above the law and can commit crimes for the greater good. Raskolnikov's journey, which begins with the murder of an old pawnbroker, is a study of the internal torment that comes from committing a heinous act. Throughout the novel, Dostoevsky explores the depths of human conscience, depicting Raskolnikov's descent into madness as he struggles to reconcile his actions with his sense of morality. The novel was groundbreaking in its psychological depth, and it marked a departure from the more straightforward moral tales that had characterized much of Russian literature up to that point. Dostoevsky's treatment of human ability to capture the internal struggles of his characters was revolutionary. He did not just depict his characters' actions. He examined their thoughts, fears, desires, and internal conflicts in intricate detail. In the years following the success of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky continued to explore the complexities of the human soul in his work. In The Idiot, he created one of his most beloved characters, Prince Mishkin, a man whose purity and innocence are at odds with the corrupt world around him. The novel delves into themes of idealism, faith, and the difficulty of maintaining one's integrity in a world full of hypocrisy and deceit. Prince Mishkin's journey serves as a contrast to the moral degradation of the characters around him, and his struggles with the weight of his goodness are a reflection of Dostoevsky's own struggles with faith and morality. In Demons, Dostoevsky turned his focus to the political and social upheavals that were sweeping through Russia. The novel, which centers on a group of radical intellectuals plotting to overthrow the government, explores the dangerous consequences of unchecked ideological zeal. Through the character of Fyodor Dostoevsky, the destructive power of nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent meaning or value, and how this belief can lead to the corruption of the soul and the destruction of society. But it was the Brothers Karamazov that would come to be regarded as Dostoevsky's magnum opus. In this sprawling philosophical novel, Dostoevsky tackles some of the most profound questions of human existence: God, morality, free will, and the nature of evil. The story revolves around the Karamazov family, particularly the three brothers Dmitry, Ivan, and Alyosha, whom represents a different approach to life and spirituality. The novel delves deeply into the moral dilemmas faced by the brothers, and it culminates in a dramatic exploration of faith, doubt, and the struggle for redemption. In the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky offers no easy answers. The characters wrestle with profound existential questions, and the novel ultimately suggests that the only path to meaning and salvation lies in embracing love, humility, and the acceptance of human imperfection. Through the character of Alyosha, Dostoevsky presents a vision of spirituality that transcends dogma and is rooted in compassion and forgiveness. The success of the Brothers Karamazov cemented Dostoevsky's place as one of the greatest novelists in history. His exploration of the human psyche, his ability to depict the internal struggles of his characters, and his philosophical depth set him apart from his contemporaries. His later works would continue to delve into the complexities of the human soul, and he would become a literary giant whose influence is still felt today. Despite the success of his novels, Dostoevsky's personal life remained tumultuous. His health continued to decline, and his finances were unstable. His writing often became a means of survival. He wrote to pay off debts, and his novels were often published in serialized form to generate income. However, Dostoevsky remained dedicated to his craft, driven by the belief that literature could not only entertain, but also serve as a means of understanding the human condition and the mysteries of existence. In the final years of his life, Dostoevsky's health deteriorated further. He continued to write, but his body was increasingly frail, and his epileptic seizures became more frequent and severe. Despite this, his intellectual vitality remained intact, and his last works, particularly The Raw Youth and the final parts of the Brothers Karamazov, reflect a mind still grappling with the greatest questions of faith, existence, and morality. Dostoevsky died in 1881, at the age of 59, leaving behind a legacy that would forever shape the course of literature and philosophy. His works remain some of the most profound explorations of the human soul, and his influence continues to be felt in the fields of psychology, theology, and existential philosophy. Through his suffering, his struggles with faith, and his exploration of the complexities of human morality, Dostoevsky achieved a depth of insight into the human experience that few writers have matched.